Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
The phrase Holy Fair is mentioned, and I'm going to turn that just down a little bit. The phrase Holy Fair is mentioned in the promotion of this. When I first heard about the Holy Fairs, I thought that it was a sacred name for these events, but it turns out that there's probably more evidence that it was a cynical name for these events. It's first clearly recorded in a poem by Robert Burns, who wrote the lyrics for Auld Lang Syne. But he was mocking these events in Scotland about how unholy many of the participants were. And so he called it a holy fair. Some people who continue to honor the sacrament service took up that name. I guess much like the Christians in the New Testament, who were first called Christians in derision, and they took up that name in honor of Christ. John Knox was a Catholic priest in Scotland, and he, along with some other Catholic priests like John Calvin in France and Martin Luther in Germany, recognized, particularly with the new translations and the printing, the more accessible, the better access to the scriptures in the language of the people who were looking at and trying to teach the Bible. They began to understand that maybe everything that the official church was saying didn't quite match up to the scriptures. And so that's where we get the phrase, the Reformation. Martin Luther and John Calvin and John Knox and others were reforming the church to match better the new understanding of the written word, the written scriptures. So John Knox was born in 1513. He lived till 1572. He lived not to see the Church of Scotland become an official organization, but he did live to see the day in 1560 where the Parliament in Scotland said, "We are no longer under the authority of the Pope in Rome." And so that was an important step toward the Church of Scotland becoming an institution of its own. Knox had several people that he could go and learn from about what their thinking was. And the two biggest names I've already mentioned, and that's Luther in Germany and Calvin in France. And he decided to go and learn from Calvin because he was living under Queen Mary, nicknamed Bloody Mary, because of her bloody support for the Catholic Church and assault on anybody who dared to question the power of Rome. He decided that he would rather learn from Calvin because Luther emphasized so strongly to obey the civil authorities. And John Knox, right or wrong, decided, I can't obey the civil authorities over Scotland. One of the things that came along with choosing Calvin as his mentor is an approach toward the dangers of emotion, of human emotion. And so was a great emphasis in the Church of Scotland that beware of emotions. John Calvin said that he did not understand why scriptures tell us to sing as a part of worship, because singing is an emotional activity and it really stirs up the emotions. But John Calvin did recognize that musical instruments added to that emotionality. And he noticed that even though musical instruments are frequently mentioned in the Old Testament, they are not mentioned in the New Testament. And so Calvin, and again Knox as a disciple of Calvin, taught strongly about a non-instrumental singing in worship. The Church of Scotland became very much more strict because they decided that the New Testament mention of songs, hymns, and psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, they all fit the Psalms, and let's just keep it simple, and we are only going to sing from the Psalms. Well, if you are trying to sing from a translation, it may have been singable in Hebrew, but it was not very singable in the King James English translation. So the Church of Scotland developed psalters. They developed a book of a specific translation of the Psalms into meter that was singable. And that became the official teaching of the Church of Scotland, that you could not do any singing in worship except from songs from the Scottish Psalter. That gave them an opportunity to really control what people were singing, and singing, you probably know in your own life, if you want to learn something, if you can sing it, it becomes more internal. And I believe that's one of the reasons that God wants singing in our worship, is to internalize that message. But the leadership of the Scottish Church wanted to make sure that their message was internalized. And so they outlawed anything other than the Scottish Psalter. The thing about it is that Isaac Watts was a very popular hymn writer from the early 1700s. And his hymns were so attractive to so many that even though it was against the Church of Scotland's rules, his hymns were sung. Interestingly enough, I'd known that for a while. I found out that the year 1800, which is our focus here this weekend, the year 1800 seemed to be a watershed year in the acceptance of other hymns other than the Psalter in the Scottish worship. It wasn't until the 1840s that the church rules changed. But in our worship tomorrow morning, we are going to be singing all from the Scottish Psalter. So we'll be singing about 4 different psalms from the Scottish Psalter. A little bit about the development of the church timeline here. 1560 is the year that the Scottish Parliament abolished papal authority. 1592, a couple of decades after Knox passed, it became the formal religion of... That card was trying to hide from me. Became the formal religion of Scotland. There were Church of England congregations in Scotland, but they were not the official church. They were accepted more or less at different times. And then James the Sixth, over the English throne that was ruling over Scotland of the time, he decided that the Church of England was going to be the official Church of Scotland because it was the official Church of England. And it just didn't work out that way. They did have to go underground for a lot of their practices, including the communion. They went out into the woods, and that was actually one of the things that drove the Scottish communion service to be held outside. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the influences there. In 1615, there were the Articles of Perth, and that was official Scottish law that tried to tamp down the emotionalism that was coming up, particularly from the communion services. And that's one of the main points that I want to make today, and we'll keep on coming back to it. The Scottish Church did not want emotion. They thought it was dangerous. But the communion service seemed to provoke emotions that the church just could not constrain and control. So anyway, also the Articles of Perth, they gave more authority to the English clergy to decide what happens in the Scottish churches. And again, that backfired. The Scottish church just grew in their devotion, in their power, and in their numbers. In 1620, 5 years after the attempt to tamp down this emotionality, Robert Blair presided over a series of communion services in Ulster, and they had thousands and thousands of attendants. So as Robert in the persona this morning of James McGreedy, what happened here at Red River was not new. It wasn't different in many ways from things that had been happening almost 200 years. So 1620, there was a very, very dynamic communion service in Ulster. That was one of the things that drew the communion practice to be held outside, is they had so many people they couldn't fit in the church building. So week after week for regular preaching, the building was adequate. But there were so many people that would come to communion service that they were driven outside. Charles II, he was restoring Catholicism over the United Kingdom, and he outlawed the practice of the Scottish Sacrament. Again, that's mid-1600s. Again, it didn't work. More people rather than fewer people practiced the sacrament. There was a risk involved in participating because it was now illegal, and that heightened the emotions that were involved. You know, I'm doing this freely is very different than I'm doing this and risking going to jail for doing it. That makes a difference in your heart and in your emotions, your feelings. So in 1707, there was an act of union. So there was a Protestant king back on the throne in England, and he was trying to smooth over the differences that had grown up between the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and the Church of Scotland. But there was still a great deal of tension. So the timing here now is 1707, not far from the First Great Awakening of the 1730s and 40s. And there was so much crossover in the clergy on the communion services that were a part of the First Great Awakening, learning more about how the Church of England and the Church of Scotland were still very much at odds over who should be in control, who should be in charge, who should decide. And the cooperation between the Anglican ministers and the Scottish ministers is much more impressive when you keep that in mind. James McGreedy, the minister here at Red River and Muddy River, Gasper River, this circuit, he referred to the courageous Covenanters, and who he was referring to is the people who continued to participate in the Scottish Communion during that time when it was illegal and dangerous to do that. John Livingston, he was a minister in Scotland, and he wrote an observation. He said that the typical Scottish service and sermon were so dry and lifeless that at communion, with the physical representation of the body and the blood of Jesus, that made the emotion even more powerful because it was in contrast to the typical dry sermon and service and singing. And so it did not take long before the communion service was really the only place that an emotional expression was expected or accepted in the Scottish Church. One of the phrases that John Livingston used in that writing was the visual gospel. So he referred to the bread and the fruit of the vine on the table as being teaching the gospel in a visible means, the visual gospel. I really like that phrase. 1741, there was a revival in Glasgow, and there were 30,000 people in attendance. There were 1,700, about 7%, who were allowed to take communion. So, who allowed them? What's that?
Can we get you one?
Well, no, I left them there, so yeah, you can pick some up. You're free to come up during the talk, but certainly after the talk. So you had to have a token, and you were given a wooden token. If you didn't get one, go back to the registration tent and pick one up. We have created wooden tokens for the Red River Meeting House Communion. But the token in the Scottish Church, you were not permitted to sit at the table for communion without your token. So where did you get a token? It came from the clergy. The clergy would examine you. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about what was being examined, what was being looked for. But just in introducing the idea of the tokens here, the clergy examined you to decide whether you were worthy of participating in the communion or not. This came from a good place. This came from a scriptural place. It came from the instructions in Corinthians to examine yourself before you partake of the communion, so that you make sure you're not taking it in an unworthy manner. The Scottish Church later in the 19th century, the 1800s, did open up communion to self-examination rather than clergy examination. But at the time of the Red River Meeting House, if you were going to participate in a Scottish sacrament of the communion, you had to have this token. And the way you got the token was to prove to the clergy that you were worthy. The service in Ulster that drew 30,000 people was so well accepted that the church there decided we need to have another one. That was in July. So in August, there was another 30,000 people who attended. Don't know how many of that was an overlap. Don't know if that was 30,000 additional or 30,000 the same or a mix of new and previous people. But then 3,000, so still just 10% of those in attendance were given tokens and allowed to participate. McCullough was the minister who was heading that, and he interviewed participants in that 1741 communion service 10 years later, in 1751. He wanted to gather as much information about the long-lasting effects of such an emotional response. 4/5 of the converts at that communion. So you weren't allowed to take communion, but there were many people who were converted to Christ at these communion services. And of those who were converted in 1741, 4/5 of them remained faithful members of the church. There was a lot of concern that if you get crowds this big and this emotional, it's just going to die out quickly. And McCullough was able to document that that was actually not the case. McCullough's writings were actually reprinted in 1802 to talk about what happened in 1800 and 1801 and was continuing to happen because in America there was a great concern about the emotionalism that was involved in these communion services. And so some people recognize that McCullough's research from 60 years earlier was valuable, 55 years earlier was valuable to reassure people that just because emotionalism is involved, it doesn't mean it's not real. Between 1741, that year of that huge revival, and 1750, so a 9-year period, there were 58 books and hundreds of articles written about that Ulster revival. None of them were neutral. They were either saying this is a fantastic thing and this is a work of God, or this is awful and this is dangerous. People were very interested in it, and there wasn't much neutrality about it. The ministers, the official ministers of the church, who was trying to tamp down the emotionality, they compelled restraint during the services, and it couldn't keep people quiet. And in McCullough's interviews afterward, he interviewed people who shouted out during the communion service. And these people reported they were not being rebellious. They just could not keep it in. The Church of England raised more objections and tried to tamp down the emotional response at these Scottish communion services. And the more that the authorities, whether it's the Scottish government, the English government, or the Scottish church, tried to tamp it down, it did not. There was another concern about the huge attendance at these services. And this was the same in other places in Scotland throughout the 1700s. It was the same in America during the Second Great Awakening. And and that was, a lot of people are coming here just to make fun of what we're doing. And that was true. There were a lot of people who came just to see the spectacle and to make fun of what they saw. A lot of those people intending to make fun of it actually were touched in their heart, and they turned. Robert Burns, I mentioned, who probably created that phrase for these events, holy fairs. A lot of what his poem was about is about the raucousness and the licentiousness, the sexual immorality, the drunkenness, the gambling, the things that were going, the cheating and the stealing, the robbing that were going on at this huge gathering of people. And that was the case. But McCullough's research, his survey, included people who came there as skeptics. And they came there for the fair atmosphere, for the festival atmosphere. They came there to have sex with whoever would. They came there to get drunk. They came there to mock and to have fun. And their lives changed. And in the Ulster area, as McGreedy was telling us this morning, the drastic difference in this area from the 1790s to 1802 with a visitor. The difference in the morality and the character and the behavior of people in Ulster after that event changed. There was a drastic difference. And I'm skipping over a lot of my cards because I've already touched on those points. So McGrady was not new to this experience of the revival aspect of the communion service. When he was in Pennsylvania, he experienced, not as a leader, but as a participant in revival kinds of communion services. There was one famous one, the communion on the Monongahela. Monongahela is a large river in western Pennsylvania. And McGready was there in 1786. So 14 years before what happened here at Red River, McGready had been a participant in a very lively and spirit-filled communion service. He had participated in the 80s and 90s in Pennsylvania, many of these revival-oriented communion services before moving to North Carolina. He moved out here from North Carolina. As the Church of Scotland was trying to establish their practices, one of the things that they wanted to do is they wanted to follow what they understood Scripture to be talking about rather than the traditions and practices of the Catholic Church headed in Rome. And so one of the things that they decided is rather than kneeling before a priest, because the priest is the intermediary, we sat at the table. And so if you are going to be here for our Scottish Communion service tomorrow morning, as we take communion, you will have a chance to come and sit at the table like you were supping with family rather than pleading with an authority to let you have access to God. You were allowed to handle the bread yourself. That was a big change. The bread didn't have to be the wafer. And they took on the freedom of baking bread. Some of it was flat bread, mimicking the Passover that the communion table is representing or recalling. But it wasn't just flat bread. Some of it was shortbread. which is kind of partially risen bread, and some of it was fully risen bread.